Nichol Kessinger know? And when did she know it?
Chris Watts' former cellmate claimed that Chris sent a woman he'd been dating, Nichol Kessinger, at least 2 letters.
Who was obsessed with who? Was Chris Watts in contact with Nichol Kessinger?
This is Reporter Room with Jessica Della Davies.
Hello, Reporter Room investigators. Today we're going to be discussing the Chris Watts case and his mistress, Nichol Kessinger. My name is Jessica Della Davies. I'm an investigative journalist. My job is to investigate crimes, potential suspects, and criminals, and show you how to consider suspects, crime scenes, and evidence in this case. So everything I'm sharing is my opinion. Opinions are not facts. Please do your own research and know that this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and give this video a thumbs up. Also consider becoming a channel member. We would love to have you. Today we're going to be talking about Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger. We're going to be looking at evidence that shows that NK was being deceptive with law enforcement. And did she commit obstruction of justice? Did she have any kind of guilty knowledge of what was going to happen with Chris Watts, or was she just another victim? Did she have any sense of what Chris Watts was about to do? We're going to start by talking about obsession. What is obsession? Obsession is a love disorder. It refers to a fixation on another person. It could be a possession or an object also. But in this case, we want to know if Nichol Kessinger was fixated on Shanann Watts or Chris Watts. And the reason I'm asking this is because NK did look up, she Googled Chris Watts on August 3rd of 2017, and she didn't work at Anadarko or work with Chris Watts at this time. So why was she looking him up? And get this, she also looked up Shanann Watts, and this is not a common name, so I don't think it's a mistake. She looked up Shanann in September of 2017. So this was such an unusual name, Shanann Watts. I just don't believe that this could have been an accident. What do you think? Because Shanann had her Facebook set to public, it would have been very easy for NK to find out a lot about her. She would have seen Chris Watts appearing in some of Shanann's videos. Did NK become obsessed with Shanann or Chris Watts? Did she decide at that point that she was going to apply for a job near where the Watts lived, working alongside of Chris Watts? Did she decide she was going to enter the lives of Chris and Shanann Watts? She would have seen Shanann's beautiful house, her husband that seemed to be doting on her, her 2 beautiful daughters. It would have looked like, to someone looking from the outside in, that Shanann had the perfect life. Now, we know this isn't true, but looking from a social media standpoint, it certainly would have appeared this way to NK. So let's consider obsession, and then we're going to talk about the multiple and demonstrative lies that NK tells in her initial law enforcement interview. You know the one that was held at the park with her father present and law enforcement agent Phillips. So we're going to be talking about signs of how someone is obsessed with somebody and stalking and all of her lies in just a moment, so please stay with me. But here are some typical signs of someone being obsessed with someone, because I believe that NK was obsessed with Shanann and or Chris Watts. So thinking about the other person most of the time, this would be a sign of obsession. It does seem like she became very fixated on Chris Watts and his family very quickly, according to the timeline that NK and Chris Watts provided to law enforcement. They got into a relationship very quickly, if you believe their timeline, and she was calling and texting him all the time. Even when she claimed during one of her interviews with Agent Kobach, She said that she wanted Chris Watts to explore getting back with Shanann, but the entire time he's in North Carolina, supposedly exploring the opportunity to get back with Shanann, NK is sending him explicit photos of herself and texting him incessantly. Stalking another person can be online, it can be physically following them, it can be unwanted online interactions, and it certainly seems like NK was very interested in following and learning about Chris and Shanann Watts. I think the fact that she looked up Chris and Shanann prior to getting the job at Anadarko and prior to entering their lives is very shady. So did NK feel jealous of Shanann, and did she want her life? Did she ultimately decide that she was going to take away everything that Shanann had? So forging relationships with everyone close to them, such as friends, family, and this is all interpersonal interactions that we see in obsessive stalking behavior. So this could also be a possibility as to why NK accepted or applied for a job with Anadarko. This would have given her a way to insert herself into Chris and Shanann's life and possibly steal the picture-perfect life that she believed Shanann was having. I believe NK did not want to disclose the fact that she had been looking up Chris and Shanann Watts because she lied about this repeatedly to law enforcement during her interviews. And the stakes were really high at this point, right? We had a pregnant mom and 2 little girls that were missing. So wouldn't NK want to cooperate fully with law enforcement? So trying to reduce the other person's contact with anyone but you, especially members of the opposite gender, him to law enforcement about laying with another woman. It seems like she forgot that she was the other woman. Shanann was Chris Watts' wife, so he wasn't laying with another woman, he was laying with his wife. It was NK who was the mistress, so NK was technically the other woman. I don't understand how she doesn't get this. Needing to know where the other person is at all times, I think the amount of phone calls and texting that NK did with Chris Watts tells me that she probably did want to know where he was and what he was doing at all times. Consider that bizarre call that Chris Watts returned to the Fredericksburg Police Department when he was describing Shanann, Cece, and Bella's height, weight, and any identifying marks. This call had to be returned by Chris Watts on his work phone, and apparently each time he tried to connect with his personal phone, the call got dropped. So was Chris Watts trying to conference in NK to this phone call with the police? I'm asking because NK has an 11-minute call on Chris Watts' personal phone at the exact same time as Chris Watts is having an 11-minute call with the Fredericksburg Police Department. Was she listening in? The fact that Chris Watts was talking to law enforcement about his daughter's descriptions and that NK was on the other line on his personal cell phone listening in, allegedly, while Chris Watts is talking to law enforcement tells me that NK definitely wanted to know who else Chris Watts was talking to. It also appears to be very controlling behavior. And the fact that when Chris Watts mentioned that Shanann had left her ring behind, of course, we know that's not true. NK's first reaction was not concern for the fact that Chris Watts' pregnant wife and 2 daughters were missing. Her first reaction was money. She told him to pawn the wedding ring, which is very callous. So consider this. NK could have been researching out everything she could find on Chris and Shanann Watts. She could have found out what he liked, where he liked to go, what type of things he was into, where he worked, where Shanann was, where they lived. She could have found out all of this information because Shanann had her Facebook set to public for her job, which was selling Thrive. So I think we have to consider the possibility that NK did stalk Shanann and Chris and then entered their lives once she took a job at Anadarko. So let's talk about NK's very first meeting with law enforcement. It was held at a local park and her father was present. There's no video of this and the audio is not the best. So I'm going to just share with you what I know about it. And her very first interview was at this outdoor location with Special Agent Philip Jones, and her father was present. This is the interview you will recall where she meets law enforcement in the park. I'm not going to try to play the interview for you because I don't think the audio is that great, but we're going to talk about some really important parts of this interview. So let's start with, when did this relationship really begin? NK starts off saying that she met Chris around the beginning of June, but she really isn't sure. So she leaves herself, in my opinion, a little bit of room in case law enforcement finds out otherwise. But when Chris Watts is interviewed by 3 agents, remember they showed up at his Dodge Correctional in Wisconsin after he was convicted? So 3 agents show up, including Graham Coder and Tammy Lee. And basically, one of the questions that they asked Chris Watts was, why didn't he have more enthusiasm when he found out that Shanann was pregnant? He claims that he's not excited about this because he's already talking to a woman at work. So were they beginning to see each other at the end of May, or was it even sooner? Now, Shanann and the girls left for North Carolina on June 27th. But if you look at the text messages between NK and Chris Watts, you can see they are already talking about how hard it would be to sleep, quote, without your warm body next to me. Now, I don't know about you, but this seems awfully fast for a relationship that just got started, according to NK, at the beginning of June. But maybe it did move that fast. What do you guys think? So consider this July 3rd birthday card that Chris Watts gives to NK. He's, being very romantic. And again, this would have been less than a month into the relationship, according to the timeline that NK and Chris Watts have given to law enforcement. The problem with Chris Watts and NK is that so many things that they've told law enforcement are blatant lies. And so it's really hard to discern where the truth starts and where the lies end. So according to NK, she went back to Chris Watts' house on July 4th, and basically she had a meltdown when she saw Chris Watts' family photos. She said she followed the dog Dieter upstairs, but again, if their relationship had just started a couple of weeks ago, and she's claiming that the relationship did not become intimate until the beginning of July, well, this is only a few days later. This is July 4th. So why is she having a complete meltdown over someone she's only been seeing for a couple of weeks? When Chris Watts was asked if he and NK ever fought and about what, Watts cuts to the bone. He says that they argued about her always, quote, being second, and that this was supposedly just 4 days into their affair. 4 days seems like a very short time for NK to be having a meltdown over the fact that Chris Watts has a wife when she knew he was married. This is why I believe that NK was obsessed with Shanann and or Chris Watts. And I'm leaning more towards Shanann. And even though she got into a relationship with Chris Watts, I believe her ultimate motive was to take everything away from Shanann. I believe she was obsessed. I believe she knew Chris Watts was married. She would have known this if she looked at Shanann's Facebook page, and we know she looked her up. And in my opinion, this goes all the way back to this whole obsession topic that I believe that she had with both Chris and Shanann Watts. In NK's mind, this relationship started when she started looking them up and researching them. This relationship would have started back in September of 2017. So was she already becoming engaged and obsessed with Chris and Shanann Watts? At some point, in my opinion, NK made the decision to take a job with Anadarko and work alongside Chris and insert herself into his life and ultimately into Shanann's life. NK's either lying about when the relationship with Chris began, or Chris Watts decided in a very short period of time that he was just going to take out his whole entire family in just a few weeks of knowing NK. No, something isn't right. I believe that Chris and NK are lying about when the relationship started. So NK denied also knowing that Shanann was pregnant. And I find this so hard to believe, you guys, because she was looking up Shanann and Chris Watts on the internet. And the fact that she knew the amount of their mortgage payment, she knew how many macros Chris was eating, she was helping Chris find an apartment, she knew how much he could afford. Again, this is so much information. This woman was obsessive. She was even looking up condom expiration dates. So the idea that she wouldn't have been looking up Shanann while she's seeing Shanann's husband, in my opinion, is ludicrous. I think NK knew Shanann was pregnant. She just didn't care. In fact, maybe part of her obsession was to get Chris Watts, but also to take away everything from Shanann. What does narcissistic jealousy look like? Narcissists tend to respond to their own painful sense of inferiority, and they do this by focusing intensely on the person they envy. They view this person as competition. One of the reasons I am so convinced that NK was jealous of Shanann is that Shanann, even after she knew that Shanann was missing and probably that the worst had happened to her and the girls, NK still took swipes and digs at Shanann. She described her as not working, and anyone who has ever had 2 children, preschool age, and been pregnant and working knows how hard that is. So I believe NK was really envious of Shanann. I believe she was focusing on her intensely. She was jealous, and she saw Shanann as her competition. We hear NK disparaging Shanann and her spending habits, even to law enforcement. This is after she knows that Shanann, who is pregnant, has disappeared along with Cece and Bella. But this does not stop NK from putting down Shanann's spending habits. And to hear NK's version of events, you would think that Chris Watts didn't play any role in his own family's financial situation. And to be clear, the reason that Chris Watts and Shanann had to file bankruptcy was due to medical debt for the most part. Both of the girls had health problems and allergies. They were eventually diagnosed as being asthmatic. Cece had an esophagus that was too small and it had to be enlarged 3 times. Shanann had neck surgery. And for those of you who don't live in the United States, we do not have nationalized health care. So if your insurance company won't pay or you are underinsured, you will be on the hook for all of this. So many Americans have had to file bankruptcy due to medical debt. So this narrative of Shanann being an overspender may in part be true, but Chris Watts was also there. He was spending and living in that nice house too, and those girls were his daughters and therefore his responsibility financially also. So in my opinion, although NK got into a relationship with Chris Watts, and I believe she was obsessed with Shanann, NK may present with morbid jealousy. The underlying psychiatric problems may show up in major illnesses like bipolar mania, and NK was reportedly bipolar. To be clear, most people who are bipolar don't have jealousy issues. By NK's timeline, we're supposed to believe that she wants to give Chris Watts his first-born son just 2 weeks after they started a relationship. So either she and Chris have lied completely about the timeline, which is possible, or in her mind, this relationship had been going on a lot longer than it really had been. Please subscribe,